President Bush offers a ceasefire to end the Gulf War. British troops killed by American fire during a major tank battle. The people of Kuwait City celebrate the Allied liberation. Good evening. The war in the Gulf is effectively over. President Bush offering a ceasefire that ended the Allied offensive 2 hours ago. His announcement came after a day of fierce fighting as the Allies tried to break the elite Republican Guard holed up in the desert of southern Iraq.
It was the biggest tank battle in history. Armoured divisions from America, Britain and France closing in on Iraq's Republican Guards, who were still trying to fight their way out of the war. The noose was tightening and there was no way out. Behind the Iraqis, the escape route across the Euphrates was cut. In front of them was the advancing Allied armour.
The gates are closed. There is no way out of here. There is no way out of here. And the enemy is fighting us in this location right here.
At times, the fighting was fierce. As the enemy took up more defensive positions, the Allies called in artillery strikes with devastating success. Iraq started the war with 4,200 tanks in Kuwait. By today, it had lost 3,000, and the figure was mounting.
You're going to add 700 to that as a result of the battle that's going on right now with the Republican Guard. So that number is very, very high.
But the Allies suffered as well. In the worst possible way, 9 British troops killed by friendly fire when their Warrior personnel carriers were attacked by an American A-10 anti-tank aircraft.
It was just a mass explosion which blew us back in the turret. And then when we looked out and seen the wagon had been hit, we moved round in front of the wagon to help the casualties. And about 30 seconds to a minute after we jumped out, our wagon got hit as well.
This morning, the British company commander called his men together for a pep talk after what he described as one of the unavoidable incidents of war.
We took a knock yesterday. You're all grown men, you're all soldiers, and we go on. I'm very proud of you last night. It didn't seem to affect what we did in the slightest. So thank you very much indeed. We go on, boys.
As more and more Allied columns pushed deeper into Kuwait, there were many smaller battles. And at deserted Iraqi command posts, US Marines, fearing booby traps, left nothing to chance.
Second on this side, covering a flank and curving around here.
This area was eventually declared safe. The Marines moved on. And along the way, they were confronted by scenes like this. Iraqi troops, hundreds of them, hungry, demoralized, defeated, and willingly giving themselves up.
They seem also to be pretty pleased to see us and quite willing to talk. They've been extremely docile and very, very easy to manage.
Some told how they were shelled by their own troops.
And the incoming was from their own artillery trying to stop them from deserting or surrendering.
They were trying to shoot their own people.
They were trying to shoot their own people.
Others were happy to surrender, even to Western newsmen, like this team from CBS.
We gave them a brisk, unprofessional frisking and some Army rations and water. They told us it was the first food and water they'd had in 3 days.
Saddam and his troops had been routed. They'd been tricked into believing there'd be a massive amphibious landing and a direct assault on Kuwait. Instead, the Allies moved their strongest armor to the west, less than 250 kilometers from Baghdad. Saddam had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, outfoxed. In Kuwait City, the last remnants of battle was at the international airport. By daybreak, it was all over. The American troops collecting the spoils of victory, weapons, ammunition, even an Iraqi helicopter. Jim Whaley, National 9 News.
The president stressed the ceasefire would only be permanent if Iraq abided by a series of conditions. It must release all prisoners of war and all Kuwaiti civilians. It must reveal the locations of all land and sea mines and comply with all United Nations resolutions, including the demand to pay war damages. Should Iraq fire any more shots in anger, the deal would be off. He set a 48-hour deadline for Iraqi army chiefs to meet Allied commanders to accept the ceasefire, and he's instructed Secretary of State James Baker to seek a meeting of the UN Security Council to formally end the war. Saddam Hussein's attempts to tailor an honourable defeat were met with ridicule.
I don't think there's any question but what Saddam Hussein is one of history's bigger losers. I can't think of a decision that he made right.
If it was all a grand mistake, no one on the streets of Baghdad was prepared to admit it.
You would tell him we wouldn't surrender.
In his speech, George Bush made a thinly veiled plea to the people of Iraq to rise up against their leader, saying the Allies' quarrel was only with Saddam.
We knew that he had very, very limited reconnaissance means, and therefore when we took out his air force, for all intents and purposes, we took out his ability to see what we were doing down here in Saudi Arabia. When we knew that he couldn't see us anymore, we did a massive movement of troops all the way out to the west, to the extreme west, because at that time we knew that he was still fixed in this area with the vast majority of his forces, and once the air campaign started, he would be incapable of moving out to counter this move, even if he knew we made it. Our plan initially had been to start over here in this area and do exactly what the Iraqis thought we were going to do, and that's take them on head-on into their most heavily defended area. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the Marines, the 1st Marine Division and the 2nd Marine Division, launched attacks through the barrier system. It was a classic, absolutely classic military breaching of a very, very tough minefield, barbed wire, fire trenches type barrier. They went through the first barrier like it was water. They went across into the second barrier line. Even though they were under artillery fire at the time, they continued to open up that breach, and then they brought both divisions streaming through that breach. But while they were doing that, at 4 o'clock in the morning over here, the 6th French Armored Division, accompanied by a brigade of the 82nd Airborne, also launched an overland attack to their objective up in this area, Al Salman Airfield. And we were held up a little bit by the weather, but by 8 o'clock in the morning, the 101st Airborne Air Assault launched an air assault deep in the enemy territory to establish a forward operating base in this location right here. Once the 101st had their forward operating base established here, they then went ahead and launched into the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. The next 2 days went exactly like we thought they would go. The Saudi forces that came in and took and Arab forces that came in and took these 2 initial objectives turned to come in on the flank heading towards Kuwait City, located right in this area here. The British UK passed through and continued to attack up this flank, and of course the 7th Corps came in and attacked in this direction as shown here. The 24th Infantry Division made an unbelievable move all the way across into the Tigris and Euphrates Valley and proceeded in blocking this avenue of egress out, which was the only avenue of egress left because we continued to make sure that the bridges stayed down. So there was no way out once the 24th was in this area. By this time, we had destroyed or rendered completely ineffective over 21 Iraqi divisions.
I wonder if you could say what's left of the Iraqi army in terms of how long could it be before he could ever be a regional threat or a threat to the region again?
Well, there's not enough left of it at all for him to be a regional threat to the region, an offensive regional threat. So it doesn't have enough left unless someone chooses to rearm them in the future.
Could I ask you 2 questions? First, did you think that this would turn out? I realize a great deal of strategy and planning went into it, but when it took place, did you think this would turn out to be such an easy cakewalk as it seems? And secondly, what are your impressions of Saddam Hussein as a military strategist?
First of all, if we thought it would have been such an easy fight, we definitely would not have stocked 60 days worth of supplies on these log bases. So, as I've told you all for a very, very long time, it is very, very important for a military commander never to assume away the capabilities of his enemy. And when you're facing an enemy that is over 500,000 strong, has the reputation that they've had of fighting for 8 years, being combat-hardened veterans, had the number of tanks and the type of equipment they had, you don't assume away anything. So we certainly did not expect it to go this way. As far as Saddam Hussein being a great military strategist, he is neither a strategist, nor is he schooled in the operational art, nor is he a tactician, nor is he a general, nor is he as a soldier. Other than that, he's a great military man. I want you to know that.
The Kuwaitis blame one man, Saddam Hussein.
The war wouldn't stop unless he was caught and tried for his crime and his ruthless and murderer. What can I say?
His is not a lone voice. Many are calling for Hussein to be tried as a war criminal.
No one should have any doubt that this man should be, if captured, and his party be tried as war criminals.
Charge 1, violation of the laws of war in mistreatment of prisoners of war and in mistreatment of civilians in Kuwait. Charge 2, crimes against the peace for waging an aggressive war, Ella Nuremberg. Charge 3, crimes against humanity for firing Scud missiles at civilian population centers in Tel Aviv and Riyadh.
The case is strong and the United States believes the butcher of Baghdad should face trial. A team of American military prosecutors is bound for Kuwait City. Their mission?
To identify those people who have actual knowledge of what went on, take their statements, safeguard those statements, and then build a case just as any prosecutor would do in the United States.
But will the tentacles of any prosecution ever reach the man ultimately responsible for the atrocities? The United States won't go into Baghdad to hunt him down, and unless Hussein falls into Allied hands, at this stage an unlikely proposition, any trial would have to be held in absentia. For the Kuwaiti resistance and the people they fought to protect, now able to socialise freely in the streets for the first time in 7 months.
To shake every American hand what they are coming to help and to let our country free.
Adults and children dancing in the streets of Kuwait City, chanting the praises of George Bush. Others vented their fury against Saddam Hussein, the man who had held them captive for 7 months. Pioneered the toll of American casualties. 23 died in the air war, 28 in ground combat, and 28 from Scud missile attacks, for a total of 79 deaths, and 53 missing or captured. A toll General Schwarzkopf called miraculous.
$128 billion to repair the country, and Australia will get a cut of the action.
Priority will be given to the Allied forces, since the Kuwaitis are overwhelmingly grateful.
But just how grateful to Australia remains to be seen.
Australia, I think, can look forward to a certain percentage of international consulting work. And we think in terms of obtaining something like 5% of large project work which is being commissioned.
Consult Australia, a body representing 100 consultants, believes that cut could reach $5 billion.
So how is Saddam Hussein likely to react to those conditions? Sure, a reasonable leader would comply immediately, but then that's not a description often applied to Saddam Hussein. Yet Bob Hawke seems confident.
Even in the experience that we've had of dealing with this man, it seems to me now unlikely that he will not comply with the conditions that have been laid down. Of course, totally reasonable conditions, which, as you know, apply to the return of prisoners of war, the detainees of other nations, the identification of mines on land and at sea, and of course the other United Nations resolutions. Because what you have now is a clear position that the whole of the United Nations Security Council, with the exception of Cuba and Yemen, have regarded the position that has been arrived as the appropriate one. And so I would rather at this point operate on the basis and in the hope that he will at last comply with these totally reasonable requirements. So let me say this, and I speak without any authority from the United States or any of the other allies. I guess the situation in reality would be that if within that 48 hours there were the beginning of real signs that there was compliance,